Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar discussing what should the next administration do about AI. We're so glad you're able to join us today. My name is Elizabeth Dickinson, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. We're pleased to have with us today a distinguished panel of experts, including Adam Kovacevich, CEO and founder of Chamber of Progress, Ashkhen Kazaryan, Senior Fellow for Free Speech and Peace with Stand Together, and Neil Chilson, Head of AI Policy for the Abundance Institute. Just as a note, as always, the opinions expressed are those of the experts themselves. In order to get right to the discussion, I will hand it off to our moderator, Adam Thierer, Senior Fellow for Technology and Innovation with R Street. You can find more about today's moderator and speakers at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org. With that, I will hand it off to you, Adam.
Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. And I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar about what should the next administration do about AI policy. Today, we'll be discussing the current state of artificial intelligence policy in the United States and consider where things might be headed after the elections come November. I'm going to kick things off by asking our panelists to help me do some stage setting, and by first examining what the Biden administration has already been doing on AI policy over the last couple of years. After that, we will explore what various administrative agencies have been up to expand their own policy coverage on artificial intelligence-related matters. Then we will conclude by taking a look at legislative outlooks in both Congress at the federal level and the state houses, state and local level. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But our primary focus today will be on what's happening at the federal level, and specifically what the next administration might do or should do on AI policy. So with that, let me first turn to Adam and ask him to help me kick things off here. Adam, we experienced in late 2022 what is now called the ChatGPT moment, where when ChatGPT debuted and came on the stage, it just really changed everything very, very, very rapidly in markets, but especially in policy. And we witnessed an explosion of policy interest in AI-related matters at all levels of government, and especially in the Biden White House. So before we get to the agency activity at the federal level, I want you to help our listeners understand and give us a feel for some of the most important things that have happened at the White House since 2022. And then after you do that, I'm going to ask Ash and Neil to come in and follow up on that. But first, help me look at first what's happening at the White House level and in this Biden administration on AI policy.
Sure, happy to. I think when I think about 2023, last year on AI policy, I think about a couple big things that happened. The first is that companies innovating in the space, the AI space, spent a lot of time in 2023 differentiating themselves reputationally. We're safer than other companies. We're more responsible than other companies. Maybe open models better than closed, and vice versa. At the same time, in the Senate, there was a pretty robust process led by Chuck Schumer, bipartisan process that involved bringing in a lot of AI executives, leaders, and nonprofits to talk about AI policy, an attempt to help get senators smarter on that. But as you said, the third big thing was really what the administration did with its executive order, which was largely focused on what the government should do, the federal government should do, what guardrails should exist in terms of public sector use, but also starting to articulate homework for the agencies. And to me, I think that was the most interesting thing about it, that it gave homework to a bunch of agencies to go do further studies on different topics, different aspects of AI. I view that as a net positive, because even though there are things that I might disagree with kind of how different parts of the administration have undertaken that homework, it's allowed different parts of the administration to weigh in, which I think has on balance yielded a balanced viewpoint. So for example, if it was just, say, the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department weighing in on AI, you'd probably see a fixation on how competitive is the AI space, which, by the way, it's very competitive, but they've been focused on that. But because the executive order brought in agencies like NIST and the Commerce Department, that review also highlighted the benefits of AI, the potential benefits of AI, and also the critical importance of the U.S. winning in AI. So, I think that you still see these homework work streams, occupying the agencies, and so on balance, I think I think, considering the alternatives, it was a pretty constructive way for the Biden White House, in my opinion, to start tackling AI policy.
And I know before the executive order, and this executive order was one of the longest in American history, we had the Biden administration AI Bill of Rights, and there's been some high-level framing by the administration of where they want to take us on AI policy that could continue on into what could be a Harris administration. Do you want to talk just at a high level about that vision and where you think things are heading?
Yeah, so
Adam?
I think, sure, absolutely. So I think that, Vice President Harris was tasked as part of the administration's work to give a speech several months ago where she was focused particularly on fairness, AI fairness. But honestly, I wouldn't assume that, that the past work would necessarily continue in the same way under a Harris administration. To me, the most exciting moment in the last couple of months on this topic has been at the first and only, I should say, debate between VP Harris and Donald Trump, where she said in one of her first comments in the debate that it is very important that the United States beat China in advanced technologies, the industries of the future, and AI. And I was just like pumping my fists. It's like, oh, that's great. Because honestly, that is a tone change. We have not seen that kind of a tone from President Biden. But to kind of really approach it from the competitive imperative of beating China, I thought that was really awesome to hear, and it gave me a lot of hope that that is how she sees it, and that we might under a VP Harris, I think, see even sharper focus on just winning the future against other countries in AI. So I'm optimistic that that we could even see a sharper focus on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let me bring Ash and Neil into this and ask them to expand upon that. And specifically, I'll start with you, Ash, because there were a lot of statements made by this White House that reflected an interest in addressing concerns about AI, and the AI Bill of Rights in particular that was advanced in late 2022 basically had a lot of language in it that was of great concern about what AI might mean for the world. Maybe you can walk us through a little bit of that side of things and like what you think about that document and that rhetoric. And then also about the many meetings. The White House had a lot of meetings with major tech executives and really put the issue front and center with Rose Garden ceremonies and so on. So Ash, let me hear from you first before I turn to Neil.
Ben, I'm only going to answer part of your question, so Neil and I don't sound repetitive. I might have been on a panel before, so I want to make sure we both kind of cover a lot of ground. So I would say that overall, there has definitely been this sense of fear and rhetoric around AI that's grounded in pop culture more than empirical evidence that we're going to see some heavy, real harms in the world with development of technology across industries and sectors. And that has been the underlying tone in the urgency and conversations that the White House has been having. I do also see, I want to validate, Adam, that there has been a positive, okay, it's good that they're kind of approaching and thinking about this as a framework, and there's some good things that have been done in the executive order, but one that sticks out to me and has been the most worrying to me has been they have been highlighting the importance of privacy and protecting consumer privacy and just overall protecting everyone's privacy and fairness as AI is being deployed, while really not talking about AI deployment by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. We have seen throughout history, and I mean the past decade or two, how technologies are being used by intelligence agencies and law enforcement as a new area where they can violate our privacy and intrude into it without any checks and balances because the regulation hasn't caught up. So to me, one of the biggest things that I've seen as tension between what they're doing and what I think they should be doing is that area of focus. And then the second one being kind of this fear as an underlying theme of everything that's happening, and also as justification for it. And I'll turn it over to Neil to take that one home.
Yeah, Neil, as we turn to you, Neil, let me ask you to specifically expand upon what the executive order did with regards to specific powers that it granted to agencies. We're going to turn to agencies in a moment, But at the high level, the language that was in the executive order that you and I testified in Congress about the use of the Defense Production Act to maybe do some of these things, and other types of expansive readings of administrative power done through executive order. Talk to us about that as you expand upon this.
Sure. It's great to be here and great to be here with this panel. Overall, as Adam said, much of the executive order, which is it's actually the third longest in history, according to, there's a whole center that tracks executive orders. It's the third longest in history, only because two others include the entire military code of conduct as part of the executive order. So this is the longest substantive executive order. Much of it is essentially a command to the agencies to nerd harder, right? Hey, here's AI. You already do stuff that's probably related to AI somehow. Tell us what, think hard about it and report back. And there's dozens of those types of reports. I think there's about more than 100 actual actions that the various agencies are supposed to take under the executive order. And so I think it did generate a lot of action, but there are some provisions that have actual substantive effect on the commercial space directly. And those are they're up top in the executive order, and they're pretty short. They compel the reporting of certain types of information from some of the bigger model developers, or I should say, reporting about large models. And so the Department of Commerce has actually put out a request for comment on that. I think comments were due last Friday. But the provision, normally the executive branch can't just say, hey, here's a whole bunch of new rules without Congress authorizing them. And so the executive order uses something called the Defense Production Act, which started in the Korean War era and has been renewed a bunch of times since then. But the purpose of that act is essentially to provide the government with the resources it needs to deal with national security emergencies and also perhaps natural disasters. There's been some updated provisions on that. And so the executive order uses that as a hook to say, we want these companies to report about the types of testing, training that they're doing, and do that under the DLC proposal quarterly, under a criteria that is sort of self-identified by the companies. And so it's a very new way. I'll just put that politely. It's a very new way to use the Defense Production Act. And in my opinion, it circumvents the role that Congress should have in this on taking these types of holistic approaches. I will say, I totally agree with Ash that there has been a sort of fear-driven narrative around the reactions to AI. But it's been interesting how much of that has been, if you follow the space closely, that fear is less about the sort of existential, at least when you look at the executive order and other government agency actions, it's less about the existential risk that people talk about, that this is going to be killer robots. And it's much more on the normal things that we talk about in tech policy and have been talking about forever, which are like privacy, bias. And so it's just using that lens to look at all computation basically and say, hey, AI is kind of everywhere now. We've had these concerns about computing generally. Let's talk about them as if they're AI concerns, and let's all like dig in and think hard about like what the government's role is here. I would have preferred that the executive order had a much bigger framing up top, even if it had the same substance, that had a framing that was like ambitious about what the US could do. That wasn't in there. That does appear to be in both the candidates' platforms, an ambition to do something big and world beating, especially vis-a-vis China. And so that, I do think that is a good tone, that we're seeing this as a necessary space to compete in. And fortunately, the US right now has the best companies in the world at this technology. And I think we should continue to build that lead, and I hope the next administration does.
Well, Neil, let me build on this and transition into our discussion about what's happening in the administrative state. We had some things required by this executive order that specific agencies undertake. And one of the most important high-level ones was this effort to embark upon a new so-called AI Safety Institute within the National Institute of Science and Technology. And that's really a big deal, which is being debated right now about like how big of a role this new AI Safety Institute should play within NIST. And then at the same time, there were reports done by another department within the Department of Commerce alongside NIST, the NTIA, which coordinates a lot of tech and telecom issues for each administration. And so there were reports on things like questions of the role of open source in AI and the possibility of auditing of AI and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna rope back through our panel in reverse order, and Neil, have you build where you just left off about like where the executive order transitioned real and meaningful new powers to the administrative state, including to agencies that don't have regulatory powers at all, NIST and NTIA. And then after that, I'm going to ask Ash and Adam to come into the conversation and get more specific about other agencies that are active now, from FTC to DOJ to EEOC and many, many others. But Neil, start with this conversation about what's happening with the AI Safety Institute, NIST, and NTIA.
Yeah, so just a little bit of table setting. NIST is a organization within the Department of Commerce that focuses very much on setting standards and best practices across a wide range of industries. They do not have regulatory power, but they are some of the, the smartest, wonkiest sort of technical experts within government. And they have served that role for a long time, most notably, I think, in the cybersecurity space, among many, many other spaces. And so not a regulatory agency, not even particularly closely connected to rulemaking historically. In contrast, NTIA is sort of the tech advisor to the White House that's within the executive branch. It is not, it's not an independent agency like the FCC, which might deal with certain types of communications technology or other types of agencies. And so it's often charged with coming up with detailed plans for the White House about, or convening information and experts to try to build a consensus around some particular tech issue. So in the AI space, the executive order charges NIST, kind of puts NIST at the center of a lot of this, right? It says that NIST needs to help establish standards around what is safe AI, and if it uses a lot of different terms about what that might mean, but it sets up this new, as you mentioned, AISI to do some of that work, and that was not, it's not authorized in any particular legislation, but it was part of the executive order. And so part of the challenge here is that not so much what NIST is doing in this space, but how people are using what NIST is doing. And so what the standards that NIST adopts are often looked to by lots of other agencies who do have regulatory and enforcement power to say that those are what is best practices, or those are the things that actually companies have to do, or there will be some penalties under other parts of law. And so that makes those rules very important. That makes that guidance very important, even though NIST itself does not have regulatory authority. NTIA, on the other hand, the executive order charges them with, you mentioned already, talking about what is the role of open source in this space. And NTIA looked at that and issued a report that really did look at the trade-offs, I think, in a very thoughtful way about like what are the pluses and minuses of open source. Historically, the fight over the tension between, or the supposed tension between open source and national security is a very old one. It's typically played out in the cryptography space, but NTIA explored it within the AI space and ultimately said that it's an important component of the AI ecosystem. It's one that policymakers should keep in mind when they develop policy frameworks, and that it is also a key component to maintaining competition within the AI ecosystem. And so that report, I think, was generally useful on a bunch of that front. And I'd love to hear more about the other agencies, but at some point I really want to talk about my favorite agency, the Federal Trade Commission.
Well, let's turn to Ash and Adam to fill us in on a couple of other things happening in administrative state, and I'll let them take the lead in terms of what they want to talk about, because there is so much, including FTC, as you mentioned, Neil. But Ash, let me turn to you first, because there's a lot of different agencies that are active here on a lot of different fronts. It's not just AI broadly, but AI and fill in the blank, AI and elections, AI and misinformation, AI and national security, AI and everything. It's taken over the world. So what have you seen developing following the executive order and these administrative actions, these agency actions on the AI front?
I'm going to mention too, as you said, there are so many that we're having kind of not enough attention span to cover all of them as experts. But two would be one, I just want to mention that's quite entertaining while concerning spat over jurisdiction between the Federal Communications Commission and Federal Elections Commission over elections and use of AI in elections. And this slightly starts going into the speech area and questions surrounding deepfakes. That's an interesting one. And there are currently some regulatory proceedings that I encourage everyone to look into around that. The one that I want to mention are FTC, and I hope this is not Neil's favorite one, so he gets to talk about his favorite stuff. FTC has been very vocal about wanting to be in the AI space. Just high level, they've talked about AI and fairness. One that I find fascinating and fun and actually maybe helpful as a millennial woman consumer, I would say, is the FTC new rule on fake and AI generated reviews and social media bots, right? One thing, I don't know if we've really articulated at the start, but what do you define as AI? Often is just technology we've already been using this whole time. Sometimes it's just, algorithms running around, making sure your life stays on track. But it can be, for example, an Instagram influencer buying fake followers or fake engagement and using that to sell their services. FTC is trying to crack down on that. FTC is trying to crack down on businesses using AI to get a bunch of positive reviews to promote themselves better. And I think that kind of very, targeted, focused on still actually very wide variety of issues, but still kind of a semi-industry is the right approach and does make sense. And again, I come from a bias of being a consumer who probably spends the most money after seeing ads on Instagram. So those are two examples. I'm happy to turn it over to Adam.
Yeah, and Adam, when you take it over here, not only feel free to talk about specifically about any agency activity you think is particularly of importance, but also at a higher level, how you perhaps think things will change under either a Harris or Trump administration with regards to some of this agency activity, which is you cover more ground than anybody else I know in the world of tech policy, from privacy to driverless cars to online safety debates and antitrust issues. And now we've got AI on top of this. So there's just so much agency activity to follow. So how are you prioritizing, and how do you think it'll change going forward under either administration?
Absolutely. Well, I think that, one way to think about it is that I think there are a couple different camps right now in democratic thinking. One of the camps that has predominated, frankly, in the Biden era has been what I call the blame camp, which tends to see corporate power as the biggest problem in the economy. And this, of course, is given a big undercurrent in neo-Brandisian antitrust enforcement, as well as a bunch of other things. One of the things that has just been baffling to me is that you've had both Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor at the FTC or at the DOJ talk a lot about concerns about competition and a potential lack of competition in AI, which frankly is just boggle the mind, considering the degree to which every single company is competing actively in this space. And if you're a company who doesn't have some kind of AI play right now, you're going to be seen as being left behind. And yet they engage, the two agencies, the two antitrust agencies, spent months talking about this, frankly, to position themselves to split up the big companies for antitrust reviews. This has been reported in the press. So some of the agencies get Microsoft and Google, and some of them get Amazon and Meta. And one of the most striking things has been, now there's reports that the DOJ is considering bringing an antitrust suit against NVIDIA. And this is where I think the tension with the other camps and the democratic thinking comes, because I think another big camp is the beat. If one camp is the blame camp, Another camp is the beat camp, which is to say the beat China camp. And if we're going to actually do as VP Harris said we should do in the debate, which is to beat China in our artificial intelligence, like who do you think is going to do that, right? It's going to be our companies, and it's going to be NVIDIA, right? And so, that is in direct odds with the Justice Department taking aim at them. The other thing that's just been so mystifying about this is you've seen both Khan and Cantor talk a lot about how AI models learning from content without permission, right? And talking about news industries and creators and things like that. And this is really the domain of copyright law and what I view to be generally fair use. And yet they're talking about this as if it's a competition problem. The irony of this is that fair use is the ultimate pro-competition policy, because if we have a norm or even a legal requirement in which AI services are required to pay producers of photographs or art or news to train on that content, Google's going to be fine. They can pay. OpenAI, Meta, they'll be fine. But what about the small companies, right? There's a small Gen AI startup called Suno that's creating songs through generative AI. There's a small startup. They can't pay, right? And so if you say you want more competition in this space, you should be embracing fair use. So I just think that they haven't really thought through how some of these policies that they've embraced are at odds with other goals they have.
That's an excellent point. And I know, Neil, you wanted to say something about FTC, but why don't I transition to you here to also talk about what Adam just discussed about this interesting diversion, or these interesting new camps within the Democratic Party, but those exist in the Republican Party now as well. There are some serious tensions about antitrust and competition policy on the right, new fault lines that maybe didn't exist before. Maybe you can talk about that and then also answer this question for me, like how would things change under a Trump administration, or will it be business as usual with maybe people like JD Vance saying, hey, I don't mind Lena Khan, I like what she does, which is a paraphrasing him, but he's what he's kind of said. So where do you see things going at the FTC and on antitrust more generally in the next administration if it's Trump?
Yeah, I mean, so much of this, history is contingent, right? And it's amazing to think about like what our AI policy debate would look like if somehow it had come pre 2016, or if it had come pre social media. But because we got this ordering, we have so much of this lens that regulators and politicians and advocates are bringing to AI from the social media and general tech fights of the past 10 years. And even though they don't really strongly apply. I mean, when you think about something like AI, it looks so different economically, business model wise, than social media does. And yet that is the lens that everybody is bringing to this, is basically these are the same companies, so the product must be the same. We should use the same economic models and the same framework, which is, big is bad and then break it up. There's nothing bigger than the China effort here. So if we think big is bad, then we should be looking at how we can get our relatively smaller effort here in the U.S. to do well. But to that point, the FTC from the very beginning, I think the first blog post they put out post ChatGPT was very focused on competition issues. That hasn't been the entirety of their work in the space. In fact, they've done quite a lot, and a lot of it has been applying the sort of traditional tools that they have of consumer protection in this new space. But they have stepped more recently. They have stepped pretty far into a new area, and I think they had a sweep called Operation AI Comply, which is a sweep of a bunch of bad actors, generally speaking, and some other folks in the of enforcement actions. And one of the cases in there in particular, it was a settlement with this company named Ryder, which provided a tool that people could use to generate text of all sorts of types. And they brought an enforcement action against them because they were worried, and there was some evidence that some people had tried to generate review content using Ryder. There was no evidence that the FTC provided that anybody had ever posted any of those AI generated reviews anywhere, but the FTC held Ryder responsible for that. They held Ryder, a tool, responsible for the uses that some of its users used. And That is a very dangerous road for the FTC to be stepping down, using their authority to not go after the bad actors, but to go after the middlemen, the tool providers in this space without any specific statutory authority to do so. And so that's the sort of thing I will keep an eye on. I don't know that that particular thing changes all that much under depending on what the administration is, because it's pretty in the weeds. But I think overall what you will see will be a really different emphasis on the approach. It won't be so much, I think the rhetoric you'll probably hear from a Trump administration about AI will not be, they'll probably emphasize a lot the competitive pressures that it brings to the biggest companies, right? In an ideal world, that's what they would focus on. How do we make sure that this is a space that's just full of competitors? And how do we maintain that? And I think on the Harris side, I think to the extent there's a deviation from, the Biden administration, I think Adam has covered it well. There is a more, it seems like a more optimistic potential vision for the benefits of this, rather than just a knee-jerk reaction that this is big and therefore perhaps bad for consumers and for competition.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's transition to the legislative arena and bring that into play. And there's really two different ways to approach this, federal and then state. And so let's compartmentalize those discussions just a little bit, because there's so much happening at both levels. At the federal level, depending on whose count you believe, AI legislative tracking services suggest that there's about 115 bills pending at the federal level. I think that might be an undercount. And this is from multistate.ai, who tracks these things. At the state level, there's something like 600, 700 bills. Like, we've lost count. There's just so many things moving now, because it's hard to even define, what is AI? What is AI legislation? But let's talk about federal level, and I'm going to turn to you first, Ash. But at the federal level, lots moving, but nothing necessarily passing yet. I want to know from you all, what the debate looks like right now in Congress. If you see things moving any better next year than this year. It seems like dysfunctionalism is the norm when it comes to tech policy on Capitol Hill these days, as we've learned from the privacy debates and other debates. Even things where there seems to be a lot of consensus, where like certain online safety bills that have a lot of supporters, they still have a hard time getting over the finish line. So I want to turn to each of you and get some high-level thoughts about this, and also what specific type of legislation, if any, could move through this Congress or the next Congress, which of course we still won't know how the makeup of that Congress will look. But assuming a divided government, tell me how you think things will play out, or what you're maybe most concerned about on the federal level legislatively. Ash, let's go to you first.
I feel like Oprah, when it's like you get an AI bill and you get an AI bill, everyone gets an AI bill. Every single legislator, I think, has fought or put forward or has a draft of a bill that might not even be an AI bill, but might be their favorite issue area or a pet project they've been wanting to push, and no one had attention span or was interested, and they add the AI in the front of the name of a bill, and now they have some eyes on it and reporting and interest and discussion around it. We can group some of this legislation high level into few, right? One is AI governance overall, and this includes everything from attempts at heavy regulation of AI to reporting or transparency ideas surrounding how do we think about AI systems. I think there's one that moved through the House in September that was about just adding AI systems to the NIST. Like NIST was adding and working with CISA to add AI systems to the it's called AI Incident and Reporting and Security Enhancement Act. And it's the National Vulnerability Database that would then, because AI is so important, they want to keep an eye out and make sure that the systems are secure. So that's kind of one group. Another group would be national security and defense overall. So DOD, I know they have hired a lot of people to work on AI. They're thinking through how exactly they want to move in this space, since other countries are moving along. And then a third one would be data protection and privacy. So, we haven't been able to pass a federal privacy legislation, but there are a lot of conversations and attempts to regulate how data is used. One of the big battles, even in the copyright area that Adam mentioned, is over training data sets and what gets scraped off the internet to be used for training. Some people argue the genie has been let out of a bottle on that, but that's a whole separate panel. But I would say the third group would be privacy. Fourth one would be, I think, employment and anti-discrimination. Those are slightly different, but obviously related. One would be there's been legislation attempts and also conversations surrounding the future of work and making sure the jobs are not being displaced. And then the second would be making sure there's fairness in hiring, there is fairness in kind of the HR part of using algorithms. And I'm going to stop myself before talking about some states who've been moving in that too.
Yep.
And we can talk about it in a second. And then I think the third one would be healthcare. Healthcare has been a big area in which AI bills have been moved and discussed. But overall, you can see that Congress is actively having hearings. This is a new energizing topic for lawmakers and their staff. And to answer your question about what might move, I think one of the main ones that I haven't mentioned that might move are conversations surrounding AI and speech, AI and deepfakes. And depending on how the election goes, if maybe someone is looking for someone to blame, and that genuinely can be Democrats or Republicans, they might turn to trying to regulate speech. And we've already seen the Honest Ads Act be brought back with just like the lipstick, like sticking lipstick on it and adding AI to basically its text. So that's kind of, I think, the general groups of how I'm thinking about congressional activity.
Yeah, that's great. Adam, let me turn to you and ask you like to comment on what you're, monitoring most closely, or more specifically, what, if anything, do you think can get over the finish line? You've been a veteran of so many of these policy wars in Congress, and you've monitored, for example, the data privacy debate that Ash mentioned. And, we thought we had a lot of bipartisan consensus on that one, and that was going to get done, and it still didn't get done this session. Can we get so-called comprehensive AI policy, or do we just get sort of like incremental movement, and on what?
No, I don't think we're going to see a federal comprehensive AI policy bill passed. Congress is an environment of legislative scarcity. Uh, so the average pass rate in a normal year is like 5%, right? It's probably even less this year. And by the way, this is a contrast to the states, particularly some of the bluest states are environments of legislative abundance. California has a pass rate of 51%. Colorado is like 75%. So so this is why, frankly, there's people pay insufficient attention to state legislatures and probably too much attention to Congress. Having said that, the things that I think are most likely to pass Congress are the things that are relatively uncontroversial and even boring. I think a good candidate for that is the Create AI Act, which would make the National AI Research Resource Pilot Program permanent. This would provide academic and non-profit research, basic science, ultimate innovation. I think that's a positive thing. It has a lot of bipartisan support, and a lot of it is about kind of making sure that the benefits of AI are spread to not just big tech, but in that we're well positioned as a society to beat China in AI. I think that's interesting because I think the things that are most likely to get through are what some people call like the secret Congress ideas, right? Congress just passed a bill to speed permitting approvals for chips and science build-outs, right? This was a bipartisan bill, but it was signed pretty quietly, frankly, over the objection of a lot of the environmental groups on the left. But it had majority, a lot of Republican votes and 70 Democratic votes in the House. And I think that's a pretty good model in that it was not, it was on the suspension calendar, which meant it wasn't highly debated. That could be a model for something like the Create AI Act coming up in like the lame duck, maybe in a relatively low profile way. But any big high profile omnibus bill, no, that has no chance. That's not what moves in this kind of Congress.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And let me transition to you, Neil, and ask you to help me bridge the gap here now between federal legislative and state legislative activity. I want you to feel free to comment, of course, on anything that Ash or Adams had to say about other federal priorities, and then maybe what you think are your concerning bills. But specifically, I want you to address a question that you and I have talked about in our own work together, including in a recent piece for Federalist Society on a sensible approach to state AI policy, which is this question is, if Congress is having such a hard time acting on AI policy for all the reasons that Ash and Adam laid out, will there ever be any sort of a national framework that does anything about the proliferation of state and local activity? And would we have any chance of getting sort of the same preemptive approach to technology policy that we got in a bipartisan way in the 1990s for the internet, with the Clinton-Gore administration working in a bipartisan way with Republican Congress to create a so-called global framework for electronic commerce? And these days it sounds like, and a lot of people saying, well, we probably need preemption at some level, but are we going to get it? Is there any chance? And then you can start to transition into the state related stuff.
Yeah, so at the highest level, it's been interesting to watch Congress react to ChatGPT, and no surprise, some of the first actions that were taken were ones that address interests near and dear to elected officials' hearts, which is their campaigns. And there was a lot of concern early on that there's going to be this flood of deepfake AI in campaigns, and every legislator's worst nightmare is that there's some video that's leaked of them saying something that they didn't say, and that somehow that goes viral. So I think that really grabbed the attention of Congress. Although I think that those bills, some of them made it out of committee, but I think they really do have a tough road to haul to get adopted overall, especially in the lame duck. I agree with Adam that it's more of the sort of deeply technocratic stuff that seems to govern like the internal workings of various agencies that nobody's ever heard of, that the popular mind has never considered, that are more likely to move. I think the Create AI Act is one of those potentially. I have some concerns about that one because it does seem to provide a really good venue for the biggest AI vendors to set the standards along with their government colleagues, and they'll set them in ways that make it hard for the open source models of the world to compete. So I do think there are some concerns there, but overall, that does seem more likely than many of the high level, comprehensive bills. The biggest problem that AI legislation has is that writing a definition for AI that distinguishes it from just general computing is very difficult, especially when you look at how it would be applied in the sort of enforcement arena. And so I think some people see that as a feature, but once you dig a little bit with the average legislator and you say, hey, like you're basically regulating all of computing with this bill, and then I think they tend to step back and be like, that seems like a big bite. And I think they're right in that caution. So what I would hope that Congress will focus on, and the things that I think are more likely to not run into that dead on, are things that are focused much more on specific applications. So, the Create AI Act has some of that, but it is still focused very much at the model level. I would hope something that helps get health information able to be trained on better, or that removes some of those barriers, or to Adam's point, some of the legislation that's looking at removing the barriers for energy, which is a critical input to this. I think some of that has legs. I think it should move. At the state level, are we going to get preemption? Preemption's like, it's hard. You'd have to get agreement on what the vision for AI is in this country, and that has to come from presidential leadership. It's not going to come primarily from Congress, right? And the examples that you pointed out in the communication space and the internet space, that was examples of terrific leadership by the executive branch, standing up and saying like, hey, this is our vision for the future. This is how this technology can benefit our country. We need a lot more of that before we're going to get Congress even having any political appetite to do something that overrules the states. And so in the meantime, the states are going to jump in. And I think, ideally what they'll adopt will be focused on their specific areas of expertise. and their specific jurisdictions. The worst is that we get not just a patchwork, but we get, states like California claiming that their particular piece of the patchwork applies to everybody, nationally and internationally. And so that's coming, and it's coming fast. But and so I think this is an incremental ground war where basically every discussion has to be, hey, let's talk not about AI at some general level, but what is the specific harm you're worried about? Are there laws that address that harm already, or that can address it? Do we need to beef those up? And are there any gaps that we need to fill that aren't sweeping in all of computing? I think we have to have that conversation over and over and over. And as long as AI continues to be sort of in the popular mind, I think we'll continue to see the appetite for state legislators to jump in.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so in the about 14, 15 minutes that we have left here, I want to ask specifics about like what's going to happen in the state. So all of us were active in the debate in California over what was probably the most important AI policy bill, and maybe one of the most important technology policy debates of my lifetime. It reminded me a lot of the sort of people that came together to fight in the so-called crypto wars in the late 1990s, a very strange bedfellows cast of characters that didn't agree on much else. But everybody hated this bill in California that would have regulated at the model level in a very aggressive way. And as you said, Neil, sort of set the tone for the rest of the nation, almost take a little bit of like an EU style approach, but apply it from the Sacramento policy level. Well, Gavin Newsom vetoed that bill, and that was a big moment. But he also passed something like 17 or 18 other little AI bills at the same time that people were paying attention to. And of course, Colorado has advanced major legislation on this front, Governor Polis. But in the process of doing so and signing it, sort of begged Congress to intervene and preempt to some degree. Big bills have been moved in Connecticut and many other states. And as I said, literally over 600 bills pending out there. So moving back to Adam and Ash, like what should we be watching out for? And Adam, I'm going to ask you to talk high level between like the Colorado model versus the California model. What comes next? What's going to look like that? And then Ash, when I turn to you after Adam, I want you to make the connection between this debate and the debate over like online safety issues, where we've already seen efforts to advance algorithmic regulation of social media, and that's AI regulation, but of a different sort, and it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. But first, let's go to Adam about high-level framing of what's happening in the states going forward.
Sure. Well, to your earlier question to Neil, like preemption is not likely at all. What's more likely is that the first mover states start evangelizing their bills in other states. So this, by the way, happens in privacy. Like one of the reasons why we don't have a federal privacy law is because California, which was one of the first states that had an aggressive privacy law, went to the delegation in Congress saying, no, don't preempt our law. We want to preserve it. Same thing with Illinois. We had the first biometrics law. So it was the first to act and say, no, don't preempt our biometrics law. I think you're going to see the same thing happen at the states. Colorado passed a very far-reaching AI regulatory bill that in some ways is as far-reaching as the bill in California that was vetoed. It has, like that bill, it had a requirement to basically kind of a prophylactic approach that requires impact assessments before proceeding. They I think both will create kind of a cottage industry for compliance consultants. Neither one is really directly focused on misuse. But fortunately, the governor expressed some concerns, and they now have a long runway before that bill gets implemented. And they're hearing from the public. But you see in the states kind of like a rush to almost like cheat codes. So like right now, you see a lot of other states saying, "Oh, well, we're just going to take what Colorado did." So the bill sponsor, the Colorado bill, spoke at the National Convention of State Legislators, evangelizing how his bill is a great bill. And then a lot of state legislators left that conference saying, okay, we'll just do what they did. And without really thinking about whether that's the right thing to do, there's a rush to just kind of copy. Similarly, a bunch of the outside organizations that liked some of the bills that in California that Governor Newsom signed, you said he signed 17 bills. They've already announced that they're going to go to try to spread those bills to other states too. And so I think that is frankly one of the things that works against preemption approach, because the first movers want to spread their approach to other states. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a sufficient discussion about like, is this a good idea or not, or is this the right approach or not?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Ash, speaking of some what I think you and I agree are some troubling approaches. There's been a lot of state activity already to try to regulate AI at the algorithmic level in terms of AI-related speech issues. You've covered this debate very, very closely. And of course, these issues have gone all the way through the courts now. I mean, do you see this being part of what happens at the state level, like the collision of, like, we've talked about AI and privacy, but AI and social media and safety AI and speech, misinformation, it seems like it's all proliferating, right?
You are absolutely right. As I said, on the federal level, and obviously, that idea spread to a state level too. All the issues legislators had or personal things they were upset about, let's say content moderation or just speech they don't like that exists, they have gotten a new boost, a new kind of level in the video game they can play, trying to pass regulation and hoping maybe this time they don't run headfirst into the First Amendment. In California, we have seen this at the same time as Governor Newsom vetoed SB 1047. He had signed in 2 bills into law that regulate deep fakes, let's say, because again, the definitions in all of these laws are very murky and incorrect. One basically punishes those who use AI for political ads, and the other one requires platforms to take those down. Only requires platforms, not, let's say, newspapers or TV stations, and also has exemptions for satire. I don't know, Twitter. I actually feel like Twitter would be X would be a great example of what Elon Musk maybe thinks is satire, might not be satire for Facebook. Anyway, so California is a good example of that. And then there's a whole second kind of movement where it's not deepfake focused, but it's focused on content moderation using algorithmic tools, and also attempts to come after Section 230, which I think I'm supposed to say once a panel. And Section 230 and the fact that platforms use algorithms and tools to moderate billions of pieces of content, then go up daily, and say that, we want you liable if you're using these tools. If it's not a person, but if you're using algorithmic tools to moderate, you should be liable, which obviously would lead to chilling of speech and less speech overall. The situation is quite both dire because no one seems to catch up that this is running headfirst into the First Amendment. There's a lot of litigation that's already, I think, within the same week as those AI California bills passed, they were challenged in court. So all these challenges are going to work their way through the courts. We're going to be talking about it for another 2 years or so until we hopefully get a ruling from the Supreme Court and move on to the next policy debate.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left before I turn it back to Elizabeth to close us out, but I want to ask Neil and Adam to come in with some final thoughts here, building on what Ash had to say about what you think will happen next year, 2025, at the state level, because it seems like we're in agreement that, we're not going to get a lot of congressional activity, more administrative activity. But specifically, first, let me turn it to you, Neil, before Adam closes it out. You and I just released a piece for FedSoc that I mentioned on, what's a sensible approach to state AI policy. And, you've written extensively on the Utah bill that's moved and that others have endorsed. So I guess, we're spending a lot of time talking about the bills we're concerned about or don't like, but, for you and Adam to close us out, like what is good AI policy look like? Can it advance? And what do you guys think it looks like? So Neil, you first, and then Adam to close us out.
Yeah, so the Utah bill is not a comprehensive AI regulatory act, right? It does 3 big things. It creates a dedicated office to coordinate AI policy matters. That's a sort of good governance. That process is not supposed to just advance regulation, but also to look at what barriers might be standing in the way of AI developers and AI users. But it also looks at regulatory gaps. It also has the state take some inventories of how state agencies are using AI. I think that's really useful. In fact, I think other states have done something similar too. That's just good governance. And it runs into the same problem that I had before, that you're going to have to decide what's AI and what's computers. That's hard, but it is useful at least to get the legislature informed about that difficulty in that definition, when they start to hear it from their state agencies, like, oh, actually this stuff's, it's hard to draw a clear line here. And also how pervasive AI as a technology already is and how it might be continuing to grow. And then third, it creates a AI learning laboratory. The whole goal of this is to work with companies to figure out where they're running into difficulties, perhaps that are unnecessary to protect consumers, but that exist in existing law, so they can experiment with how they could do this in a sort of sandbox-like manner. How can they develop new products without running afoul of the law? So I think those are some pretty good starts. I think good AI legislation looks like targeted at harms. But again, I think that it has to start with leadership at the rhetorical level from the executive branch that points out that this is a powerful technology, that we're in a race with China and other places that don't share our American values about what good looks like in a space that has a lot of implications for speech and for important decision-making that people will be using. And I think we got to start there. And so I want I want the executive branch to do more in this space, more at the rhetorical level, more at the bully pulpit level, to get America excited about this technology and eager to deploy it and use it and set the right policy environment for it.
That's great. Excellent. So let's transition over to Adam to close us out. Adam, final minute or two here, just high level. What do you think a good AI approach looks like, either out of the administration or the states?
Sure. I think, as I said earlier, we will see a lot of the bills that we saw this year come back next year in states, because that's just the way state legislatures work. They have a copycat effect, and the organizations that push those bills will push them. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a bill like California 1047. It's going to be back in California next year, but it'll be back in other blue states too. So just be prepared for that. What's like the state equivalent of a good constructive bill like Create AI Act? Well, I think there's probably a lot of room, as Neil was saying, for states to do things about using AI to make government services better. Like, Democrats, we're the party of government services. We want government to work better, right? And so, like, I would like to see a lot more legislators try to take up that challenge in just delivery of state services, making that better. And I think, there's also opportunity to say, okay, well, like, to the extent we're concerned about things like fairness and housing and employment and these traditional areas where non-discrimination laws apply, maybe the answer is somewhat, is a fairly easy amendment of existing anti-discrimination statutes to include AI abuses. And that could be, frankly, a common sense way of approaching some of those concerns. They're just building on what's already there. So those are the two areas that I'm kind of eager to see more from state legislators.
Great, wonderful, good summary. Well, thank you, Adam, Ash, and Neil. Wonderful conversation today. I'm going to hand it back over to Elizabeth to close us out from Federalist Society's end.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us and for sharing their points of view today. And thanks to our audience for tuning into this program. For more content like this discussing the regulatory state and the American way of life, please visit us at regproject.org. That is regproject.org. Thank you.